Welcome to the Training Ground Guru podcast in association with Teamwork's Intelligence. In every episode, we bring you insights into the teams behind the teams in professional football. Coming up on today's episode.
Where I think we hopefully see some evolution is on, again, I keep pounding this, but on the execution side. If you looked at the clubs that are using data heavily, Liverpool's of the world, the Brentfords and the Brightons and so on, I bet if you asked them, would they be better off making great decisions with worse data, or having better data but having a worse process? They would choose the better process and worse data all day long.
I'm Simon Austin from Training Ground Guru, and our guest on this episode is Luke Bornn. Luke has been a leading figure in sports analytics for the last decade. After working as an assistant professor at Harvard University, he became head of analytics at Roma and then with the Sacramento Kings. In 2020, he co-founded his own company, Zelus Analytics. This is a sports intelligence platform providing data-driven insights to top teams, including Toulouse and AZ Alkmaar. Last year, Zelus was acquired by Teamworks, the sponsors of this podcast, and it became Teamworks Intelligence. Luke spoke to me about what he's been doing since we last spoke on the podcast in 2021, about his groundbreaking work with Toulouse, and about the future of sports analytics. We hope you enjoy listening to this episode, and if you do, please give us a follow via your preferred podcast provider. Thank you very much for joining us on the podcast, Luke.
Yeah, thanks for having me back.
Yeah, and you're actually the first person that we've had on twice, so I don't know if that's an honour or not, but it's good from our point of view.
Yeah, and I'm certainly happy to be back on. Really enjoyed the conversation last time, and happy to pick it up, 4 years later.
Yeah, so it was actually July 2021 when you spoke to my colleague Josh. And a lot has happened in that time, both in your own career and the wider analytics community and industry.
Definitely.
So, first of all, can you tell us a little bit about what you've been up to with Zelus in those 4 years?
Yeah, so, when we spoke in July of 2021, Toulouse would have just missed promotion on an away goals tiebreaker. And so since then, my time has been spent, most of it on the sort of running and management of Toulouse, and then a smaller part on sort of Zelus, which is sort of the more technical analytics piece. And actually Zelus, we sold to Teamworks last August. So sort of full cycle. And then also in Toulouse, and we were briefly involved in Milan as well, but Toulouse, we also divested from that a few months ago. So what's fascinating is that I think, when we last spoke, I was deep in the trenches with those clubs and with Zelus, and now everything we've sort of been in a very different state now, certainly with the clubs.
So was Zelus brought in as a consultancy with Toulouse?
Yeah, so the origins of the Zelus sort of soccer group, now Teamworks Intelligence soccer group, was actually sort of as the analytics arm for Toulouse. It was essentially Toulouse and AZ Alkmaar's shared analytics group, and essentially shared because my partner Billy Beane was involved with both clubs, and then at some point sort of made the decision to roll that into Zelus alongside the work that my co-founder Doug Fearing had done. So it's actually less so that it was the separate thing that we brought in. It was actually the other way around, that it started as our own internal analytics capabilities for Toulouse and Alkmaar, and then we sort of packaged it up commercially within Zelus. And
we had Damien Comoli, the chairman of Toulouse, on the podcast after you, which was very interesting. And I mean, the club had a huge period of success during your time with him and Damien's time with him. He won the French Cup, and this is a club that hadn't won any trophies really before.
Right.
Played in the Europa League. And Damien was outlining how analytics was a huge part of what the club did. So, what was your kind of involvement on a day-to-day basis?
Damien sort of nailed it. I think analytics was sort of the driver of everything that we did. We had a lot of success, which certainly made things easier. The first year, which is, of course, right before we talked last time, we really had hit our goals financially. We had brought our payroll down drastically. When we inherited the team, we were over 30 million euro payroll. We got to under 10, which sort of means a huge fire sale on players and all that kind of stuff. But only in year 2 did we sort of really start to get rolling, where we won the league. We set, I think, a league record for goals scored, and the next year won the League Cup. which, well, truthfully, winning the cup is always maybe more luck than skill, but I'll take it. And the funny thing is, if you ask the players what the highlight of all that is, winning the League Cup, they will tell you is when we beat Liverpool at home in the Europa League. So as funny as that is, despite lifting a trophy, for some reason, it was the beating of Liverpool. So anyway, to answer your question, my sort of role was really at the ownership level. So we sort of pre-Toulouse, doing diligence on all the sort of clubs that we were looking at, and then bringing in Damien as our chairman and sporting director, bringing in all of our analysts, all that type of stuff, and then really putting in place processes and systems to sort of keep everyone aligned and on track. And we were really fortunate that we had Damien on the ground in Toulouse, obviously incredibly talented executive and a huge part of our success. So that certainly made life easy for us there. The way I tend to think about it is that Damien really, handled everything day to day, so that we didn't have to think about any of the nuts and bolts. And our focus was really on larger timescales, thinking about squad management and so on from maybe a monthly or multiple year-long time horizon. And certainly Damien was involved at that level of view as well, but he was sort of the one that would handle all of the day-to-day operations.
And the reputation that the club had was that data did kind of infiltrate into every aspect of the club. So I even heard about style of play, that was very, very well defined with data, and then that informed the recruitment as well. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that is fair to say, but it's not necessarily that the data was overly prescriptive. I think what I would say is that from the data, there's sort of certain things that we know to be true, or we sort of observe to be true, and maybe there are other things that, maybe this is an edge or maybe it's not, and then there are things that are sort of just noise. And so we just really focused on the handful of things that are going to really create advantage and leave the rest up to the coaching staff to give that freedom. The equivalent maybe in basketball when I used to work in the NBA was, you might tell your coach, hey, we really don't want to take mid-range shots, these sort of bad, long 2-point shots. Those are really ineffective. And then also, let's just make sure our best free throw shooter is the one taking technical fouls. Other than that, do what you want to do. Right? That's kind of how we operate. It's let's make sure that we're doing the things that we know to be true and we know to add value. And then, otherwise we don't want to make sure that we're giving people the freedom to do their jobs.
And I know I listened back to the last podcast, and I think it's fair to say some of your experiences in football were a bit mixed, or what you thought about the way football was using analytics. Would you say Toulouse then is a very good model of how clubs should use analytics?
I think every club that uses data uses it sort of differently. Like if you look in baseball, you look at like the Dodgers or the Tampa Bay Rays, for example, they have analytics staffs that number into the 30s, 40s kind of thing. And they're really exploiting every single possible edge you could get. I would say at Toulouse, in some sense, we were operating at 80% efficiency with the data, essentially realizing that we can get a lot of edge by just doing the simple things really well. And so if I were to describe what we did, it was sort of really focusing on using best practices with data to make decisions around squad management and the roster and maybe a little bit of playing style and so on. And then every other area of the organization is just sort of making sure that we're following best practices and executing them on sort of the leanest way that we possibly can. The part of Toulouse that's less sort of well known is that we were break even or profitable the whole time. And essentially what that requires is both sort of efficiency in the transfer market and in your squad management, but also making sure that you're efficiently deploying resources in the academy and the stadium throughout. The way we operated is essentially to figure out, hey, what's the sort of best practice in each functional unit of the club and what's the leanest way we can execute on that. And we ran a really lean ship, and we were able to have the success we did in a really financially sustainable way.
So you would be operating on the commercial side as well, not just the football side of the club?
I had very little involvement in the commercial side. I'd be involved in those meetings maybe, but I shouldn't take credit for that. We partnered with the folks at Redbird Capital Partners at the time. Actually, the group we partnered with is now called Otro Capital. But we essentially bifurcated it such that we ran the football side and they had the commercial side. We had good people on the ground that did a lot of the sort of the legwork. But yeah, I know nothing about ticketing or sponsorship deals. That is not my area of expertise.
And actually, I know when Damien was on the pod, he was very keen to emphasise that it wasn't just about data. That was a part of the jigsaw. And he was also very big on culture, man management, those more human aspects as well.
Yeah, I think it's natural to think of a club that's being run quote unquote with data as sort of being this like pure robot, and ultimately you're still dealing with humans. The way I like to think about it is that humans are really good at certain things. They're really good at empathy. They're really good at, as you say, the man management piece, the sort of human piece. Where humans struggle is on certain decision-making tasks, particularly when it comes to talent identification and so on. And in that case, we know that statistical models are just better, at least better in certain cases where certainly for certain types of players with certain amounts of data and so on. So it's really about what are the areas where data can remove some of those sort of cognitive biases that are inherent in human decision-making. We're not robo-GMing this club, right? It's still humans and as I mentioned earlier, a lot of it's sort of using the data where the data's good and then using the people where the people are good. And then as much as possible, having clear processes in place around that to make sure that you're sort of continuing down that path, because it's super easy if the statistical model misses on one player to sort of drift back to the old way, or to sort of like become a bit robotic when you're used to making data too much and realizing, no, these are humans. These players are, many of them are kids. They're 18, 19, 20 years old, and they're not ruthless professionals, right? They're human beings, and you have to sort of account for that when you're managing them.
And when you say data's a lot better, is that because of the scale that it can do things, and also because of the biases humans have, as you say?
If you look at the history of what makes humans good at things, so like what, whether it's like a doctor's good at reading a x-ray or what have you, you essentially need a couple things. You need to have the same thing happen on repeat. So like, you need to see, if you think of the doctor example, you need to see x-rays repeatedly, and you need to sort of make a decision, and then you have to have really quick feedback on whether you're correct or not. So the places where we get good is things where we do things on repeat and we get immediate feedback. So think of a musician, right? They're practicing their piece of music. I got these guitars here. If I'm practicing a piece and I misplace my finger slightly, I get immediate feedback that, oh, that note did not ring out, or hey, I hit the wrong note, or I got the timing, I played it slightly early or slightly late. And so the reason sort of you can become so proficient at it is that you can do it on repeat, sort of in this sort of homogenous way where you can play the same things or very similar things and with slight variation, and you get immediate feedback on that variation. In contrast to that, if you think about talent identification in sports, you're maybe making a decision about hundreds of players, probably more realistically, more like dozens of players, where you're doing sort of thorough evaluation. You're essentially trying to say, will this player be good in 5 years? For young kids, that's certainly what you're doing. And so you don't get feedback in any meaningful amount of time. So it's really hard to become good at this. And if you think, oh, but hold on, I saw a bunch of these players that are good now 5 years ago. The problem is that humans inherently like misremember their own past. Right? We tend to have a lot of hindsight bias. We tend to think that we were better decision makers than we were, tend to think that we were smarter than we were at the time. And that leads to biases and overconfidence, for example, in our own abilities. Statistical models don't have those problems. There's a reason that bookies these days rely on statistical models. They're not using humans to say, oh yeah, Liverpool's going to beat Manchester United by this much. That's not at all what they're doing, right? Here's a statistical model because they know that these models are just better.
That was very interesting what you're saying about the long-term forecasting that you need in football, particularly with recruitment, because I think football finds it very hard to assess, for example, a sporting director for that very reason. Would you agree with that? Because they are long-term bets, but football wants quick results, basically.
Yeah, look, Damien kind of got the rough end of this from a handful of his transfers that he did at Liverpool, right? Where early on, somebody saw that, that they didn't work out or whatever. But if you look in hindsight at the set of decisions that he made, had a great long-term impact on the team and set them up for success in the future, right? So the time scales are challenging. You're absolutely right. I had dinner last night with some of the staff from the Cleveland Guardians. That's the baseball team in Cleveland. They were saying that they for the last decade have overperformed their payroll, but despite that, their models, there's still like uncertainty whether they're actually like a good front office or not. There's always just an inherent, you're operating on long time horizons, and you're only recruiting. In baseball, it's a few more because you have your minor league system, but in football, you're really talking about you bring in 5, 8, 10 players a season, not a game. And so hard to sort of value, there's just a lot of randomness in those outcomes. You could have an incredible sporting director come in and miss on 2 or 3 high profile players, and they could still be a great sporting director. That's why it's important when I think about valuing executives. It's really about saying, hey, can we of course you can't see this as a fan, but can we really look at the process that they're using and how they're making decisions rather than the actual decisions, right? So if they're really using best practices and making decisions in a really sound way, in a repeatable way, then yeah, they're going to have some misses just due to randomness. But I would rather have that than someone who's sort of operating off the cuff and, the first season happens to have 2 great successes, because I would rather go for the thing that we know to be repeatable.
In England, I think we've also had a phenomenon of the unicorn manager, and that was something Dave Reddin, who was head of strategy for the FA, he coined that phrase. And it seems to me that a lot of the best managers, they happen to be at the best clubs with the best setups, the best recruitment, Brentford, Brighton.
The most money.
Yeah. So is that very hard, again, to evaluate a head coach or a manager, do you think, and separate them from the club they were at?
Very hard. I'm sure you can think of tons of examples where people say this guy's the greatest coach, and then he gets poached to a big team, and his old club brings in a new coach, and the team does just as well, sometimes better, right? And I think we have this. I'm not sure why. It's actually more common in England than I think elsewhere, even in Europe, but this real tendency to sort of attribute all success and failure to the coach. Right, and the coach certainly matters, but you have 11 players out on the pitch, and for the most part, once the kickoff happens, the coach has very little influence. He might scream as much as he can from the sidelines, but there's very little that they can influence. So it's largely the players at that point. So I'm not sure why. Maybe it's because they're the most visible. Maybe it's because they're the one that does the press conference afterwards. We tend to attribute a disproportionate amount of good or bad to the coaches. And in reality, there's a lot more that comes from player skill and so on than I think we oftentimes get at. And so that's similarly why, it's challenging to identify coaches. It's challenging to find good ones because, even if you look at, this is true historically of transfers, it's very hard to find coaches that sort of predictively add value to your club, because when you're looking at them, the biggest driver of a team's success is largely player skill. And so, it can be hard to disentangle that. To have enough sort of data or information to know if a coach is really good, you need to have seen them win with multiple different unique sets of players, right? You need to basically say, like, hey, this guy had success with one squad and then a totally different squad 3 years later and a totally different squad. He can maintain success, right? But by the time that happens, they become unattainable financially. And so it's a really interesting sort of challenge. And so, we went through a couple coaches at Toulouse and our focus was really on, again, going back to sort of the process versus results, finding someone who's really aligned with our way of thinking. A lot of coaches will say, I play a very particular style, and then I want to recruit to that style. And there's nothing wrong with that approach. That's a super valid approach, another way to go about things. But the way that we did recruitment, our approach is very different. Say, hey, we're going to work to build a squad that is sort of balanced, but not specifically focused on a particular style. We might play a very sort of ball possession on the ground style, but if all of a sudden we have an opportunity to acquire an incredible target man at a great value, then yeah, we might want to alter our style a little bit. And we made sure that we had a coach that had that tactical flexibility. So instead of saying, hey, here's my rigid tactics and we need to get the specific exact players for this tactical system, it's saying, here's a bucket of players. And look, we're not giving you 20 left backs. We're giving you a balanced squad. But the idea is to say, it's then up to the coach to decide what's the best tactical system to execute on that. And so that requires a lot more sort of flexibility and sort of tactical intelligence. And so that's sort of how we thought about coach recruitment, as well as a coach that's just going to be easy to work with, going to work within the club system and so on.
Oh, that's really interesting, because that has been a huge debate in England, again, as you're probably aware, with certain head coaches very wedded to a certain style of play. And that has even seemed to be attractive to some clubs, but you went for the opposite of that then.
The opposite. But again, you got to hire someone with tactical flexibility. So if you bring in someone who's only ever played a 4-4-2 and you happen to bring them in a system where you have, great attacking wing backs and they like force them into a defensive fullback style. So you need someone that really has that tactical flexibility. And so there's certainly pros to sort of recruiting to a specific style. You can really sort of like get that great alignment. There's multiple flaws, but there's the two big ones are that when you do that, you're really sort of constraining your possible squad. So, imagine you're playing a very particular style, and you say, I need players of very particular archetypes that sort of fit within that style. As a result, you're drastically reducing the sort of set of players that you're interested in. And that means if for whatever reason those players are really expensive, relative to their contributions, you essentially are going to get really poor value. And so given that you have sort of a fixed budget, you're actually going to get lower quality players than if you maybe got players that are sort of outside of that tactical system. You get better value. And so it's like, are you better sort of for a given budget? Again, that's the key part. For a given budget, you might be in a situation where you have to decide, would I rather have worse players that fit this system perfectly or better players that are a slight mismatch? And that's essentially like the decision that's going on. And then the second piece of why this is problematic, you see this over and over again at the big clubs where they'll recruit to a given manager's style and then they get rid of the manager. They bring in a new manager with a different style. That manager wants to change things drastically. So this, to be clear, is not the coach's fault, right? It's the club's fault for bringing in someone who on repeat with different styles and sort of different types of players, and then you end up with these huge budgets and so on. So that's obviously a recipe for failure as well. But
it basically gave you greater flexibility, you think, in terms of recruiting players and coaches as well.
Exactly right. So the way, if you go back to my experience years and years ago in the NBA, there was a time when, actually it's still true now largely, that three-point shooters like the Steph Currys of the world, let's say 2015 to 2020, this was like before the game was starting to accelerate this way, but there wasn't the talent there at those positions. They became extremely expensive. So like having shooters was very, very expensive. And so in terms of like a return on investment, you were oftentimes better saying, okay, let's just have a mediocre shooter and let's put like a great other players around them. So I heard a story in baseball where, going into the trade deadline and saying, we are the weakest team in the league in our relief pitching. So this is like, the pitchers that come in after the starting pitcher. But the cost of those pitchers was so immense. So we made some decisions and we actually, rather than sort of going from worst pitching to try and get average there, it was a better return on our investment to go from the being the 15th best shortstop to the 3rd best shortstop. So like sometimes it's better to improve on your strengths than sort of try and tackle those weaknesses. And it's really a function of ultimately what's the ROI on that investment. And from a fan, that's really hard to understand because you just see the end player come in and you think, hold on, they have the worst left back in the league. Why in the world did they go buy a right winger? This makes no sense. Let's say they were going to spend an extra $5 million. It's possible that they made the decision that $5 million was better deployed in terms of improvement of the team at that position. Taking them from having an average right wing to a great right winger, that was a better return on investment than going from a bad left back to a mediocre left back, for example. And
is there generally value if you could be counterintuitive then and go against the herd, go against the norms?
Yes, certainly if there are if you look right now, like everyone has sort of copied the Pep and Klopp style, right? In fact, football's become a little bit
homogenous.
Dare I say homogenous? Good. That's a good one. It's like I was going to say hard to watch.
Yeah.
Because of that, and so I think that the teams that really sort of deviate from that, like what comes to mind is the Barnsley team from a couple of years ago that like played the craziest long ball style I think I've ever seen, and had a lot of success with it. So zagging when others are zigging is valuable, but only in so much as that when you're going in a different direction, it's not sort of ways that are less efficient. So like in the NBA as an example, I keep hammering on basketball on a football pod, but every team is moving towards taking more 3-point shots. If you say, we're going to not take 3-point shots to be, differentiated, the problem is like that's a very inefficient strategy, not taking 3-point shots. It'd be like a football club saying like, no one takes short corners anymore. We're going to start taking short corners again. And it's like, that's a bad idea. Short corners are very inefficient. And so where you want to be orthogonal to others in terms of having a, differentiated, is just, you just want to do it in a way which isn't making you worse.
Because as you were talking there, I was thinking about Nottingham Forest, who I think have got a very different style to the norm. That counter-attacking, fast wingers, the big front man. And they maybe got good value with that big front man because other clubs weren't looking for him within their styles. Right. So. And they've had a really, really good season, because of that.
And that makes a ton of sense, especially if you're sort of a average to lower tier team. Not that Forest necessarily is, but you're to sort of say, hey, we're going to play the Man City, Liverpool style of like ball possession and so on. You remember the World Cup winning French side, a few years back, they essentially like just counterattacked like crazy, and certainly for teams that don't have the ball a lot, that's a really logical way to construct your squad in those cases. And it actually can be one of the reasons why clubs that get promoted can struggle, because they oftentimes have a squad that's built to dominate in the lower league, and then they go up and all of a sudden those players, like their attacking players that had the ball constantly in their lower league, now never touch the ball, and a very different sort of style potentially.
Yeah, definitely. So how much time were you able to spend with Alkmaar during this same period?
Very, very little. I got to know those folks really well, but I never had a formal role at Alkmaar. They sort of worked with us at Zelus. Again, now Teamworks. Billy Beane was always an advisor there. And my role was really sort of just, I became close to them from sort of almost like a colleague and friend. But no, I had no management role there. Even though I got a lot of respect for those guys. I think it's the best run team in Europe for the last decade in terms of how they're operating relative to their resources. Incredibly well-run club. Robert Einhorn was the CEO there for a decade. He actually just departed, and they have a sort of new leadership now. He, I think, after 10 years, thought it's time for a new challenge. But incredible respect for what they've accomplished there, where they've punched way above their weight. They've done it in a really financially responsible way, continuing to make decisions in a sort of really process-driven, efficient manner. And yeah, really, really impressive club.
Very, very innovative club again, aren't they? They remind me of Brentford a little bit. The sort of stuff they were doing with neuroscience, with youth development, with lots of areas.
Yeah, they placed really strategic bets, but they were really focused on the sort of handful of things that matter. You point out the neuro stuff and so on. They did place a handful of these strategic bets, but I find one of the things that clubs do wrong is just do way too many things. They'll spend time and resources on, the latest sports science gizmo and gadget, and they'll go down some rabbit hole of some newfangled sleep thing and all these whatever it might be. And, what they did well is sort of really focus ruthlessly on these sort of the core things that drive value, and then very selectively invest in sort of innovation. That's
a very interesting thing when you say the most... What did you say, the most efficient club in Europe? Or?
If we're talking about Alkmaar, probably the most efficient club.
Yeah.
This is actually true across sports. I think teams tend to do too much. They tend to be distracted because the truth is most of your value comes from, in terms of building a team, there's probably, ultimately, if you think about through a course of a season I'm really thinking from sort of the sporting director perspective, there's probably 10 to 15 decisions in a year that drive 95% of the value. And maybe 10 of those are things around recruitment decisions. And the other 5 are maybe like major decisions around the tactical style you're going to stress or whatever it might be. You're getting distracted with all these other things. It can be a detriment to those sort of bigger decisions, right? Like when I was at the Sacramento Kings for a long time, and I remember them making a decision around a free agent that was like $100 million decision, and they made it in like 30 minutes. And then another time spending like 4 weeks on what was essentially like a fringe player that played for the team for like 2 weeks. I think like this is backwards.
I guess that's the Steve Jobs thing again when he came back into Apple. I think they had maybe 20, 30 products. And he, I think, then brought that down to about 4. And he said, we're going to be world leading in these 4 products rather than spinning all these plates in kind of a mediocre way.
Totally. It's making the main thing, right? There's this other sort of more subtle problem there that you get into that people don't really think too much about, which is think of from like a recruitment perspective. If you're okay, you got your analytics group and your player evaluations, you got these great statistical models valuing players, awesome. And then okay, now we have our medical staff and we have our psychologist and we have we maybe bring in these outside people to assess a player's cognitive capacity and maybe another person or the decision maker or whatever. And you start like doing all these different things, and then you bring everyone to the room and you say, let's make a decision. I've seen this multiple times where, you might have your analytics group and let's say your scouting group are represented maybe by one person. And the sort of analytics person in the room might represent a team of 10, or, if you're using someone like Zelus, you're representing like dozens of people, the work and effort of dozens of people that's been heavily back tested, that's been used and validated over a decade. Maybe you have a head of scouting there that represents a scouting group of dozens and sort of synthesizing their knowledge. And then you have a psychologist who like asks these players 20 questions and is making a judgment on there. And the sporting director is giving sort of equal weight to all of these things. These things can actually, in some sense, sabotage the decision-making process where you sort of misweight them. You're putting too much importance on these unvalidated, untested ideas. This happens a lot in sports science, like a ton in sports science, where we know the things that really matter are load management, which I would just, if I were to define really briefly, it'd be make sure the players work really hard on a Wednesday and barely move at all on a Friday. I'm exaggerating a bit, but that's kind of, that simple weekly periodization. It has been really shown to be effective. If you then say, okay, we're going to try this new machine where we're looking at like creating ankle stability, and we're going to try this other gadget and this new fancy workout and whatever. The real limit is player time and attention. And so anytime you're doing these sort of unproven, untested things, you're taking time and attention away from the things that create competitive advantage. And so that's why, like, as an organization, you need to be ruthless about sort of paring it down and really focusing on, again, keeping the main thing the main thing.
Teamwork's intelligence gives clubs an edge that can enable smarter decisions faster. When most teams are drowning in data and not getting nearly enough out of it, Teamwork's intelligence can clear the way. Built by a powerhouse team of sports data scientists, engineers, and football data experts who have been shaping this industry for over a decade, we understand the challenges teams face. With data now at the forefront of scouting, recruitment, and team analysis, Teamwork's intelligence has built a platform that turns billions of data points into precise models, predictive metrics, and insights that actually make a difference to a club's performance, both on and off the field. Ready to level up? Head to teamworks.com to learn more.
You talked about Billy Beane, and he's obviously a legendary figure within sports analytics, following the film with Brad Pitt. Has he been heavily involved with Alkmaar and Toulouse as well?
Yeah, he's certainly been involved in the ownership group. But, for the first while, he was also he was running the A's, so it was a part-time thing. But like he's been interested in football for 10 years. I think maybe it's 15. I think at this point, right? And I think fell in love with the game years and years ago, and certainly played a very strategic role over the last few years. There's all these things that sort of go on at ownership level that really aren't sort of top of mind for the media, for the fans. Things like investor relations and budgeting and all that kind of stuff. And so a lot of that happens behind the scenes, and he was sort of added an incredible amount of value in all those areas. You
had the sale last year to Teamworks.
That's right.
But you're still staying involved then with Zelus despite that acquisition.
Yeah, Zelus has sort of been running in parallel to this. As I said, it started off sort of as a spin-off of sort of Toulouse Analytics Group in a way. And, at the time that we merged in with Teamworks back in August, we were about 75 employees with a pretty broad coverage across all the major sports. So a big group in basketball, baseball, American football, cricket, etc. Yeah, after that acquisition, I continued to be an advisor there. I actually really love what they do. I love their vision. I just think they're solving like a real problem in sports. And I think there's a lot of companies on the periphery of sports that are just kind of leeches. But I think that Teamworks is actually like creating a lot of positive value for clubs and for the ecosystem. So, plus I really like the people. So been really happy to sort of stay involved there.
Yeah. So when you talk about that with Teamworks, what is it in particular? Is it kind of the breadth of what they do? The multidisciplinary stuff?
The way I think about what they do, and their CEO might sort of phrase it differently or word it differently in a more eloquent way, but what I would say they do is that, just if you think about it from the club perspective, clubs should not be software development companies. They should not have to build out their own information systems and their own messaging platforms and their own athlete management tools and their own data engineering backends and their own sort of core data infrastructure and so on. Functionally, every team is doing the same thing on repeat. Clubs don't get value from having better data pipelines. They don't get better competitive advantage from having yet another, expected goals model or some possession value model or something like that. They don't get the value from sort of building out these foundational things that everyone has, right? Maybe that's not quite true if they don't have anything, but where they get value is on the execution piece, is using this stuff to make better decisions and ultimately win on the pitch. And so, if you look at the ecosystem 10, 15 years ago, maybe even farther back than that, early days of Catapult and so on, the sports scientists were using Excel to manage this data, right? And at some point we realized this is a huge time and effort. Like, let's use some of these athlete management systems, right? Smarterbase came along and it was like, this solves a lot of problems. And for a tiny fraction of the amount of time and money that we're spending building internally, we just get this great tool and we can just spend our time on what matters, which is on the execution side of it, right? And so that's a very small example, but that applies much more broadly, where going back to sort of making the main thing, if you're spending your time like thinking about data engineering decisions and about how you want the sort of micro nuances of your communication platform and how your video is transmitted and stuff, you're not doing the things where you're really adding value. And so where Teamworks comes in is to say, hey, look, we're going to do all these things, build all this software, this sort of operating system ecosystem for what clubs need. And it's, messaging, it's athlete management, it's nutrition monitoring, it's analytics. It sort of does it all in a way which gets you 80 or 90% of the way there for what every club wants or needs, all the sort of foundational core things that every team needs and more, and really let you focus on the communication, the integration, the execution, which is really where the value creation is. So instead of spending your time recreating the wheel, it's sort of they say, here's the wheel, now do what you really do, which is sort of get it rolling.
And does being part of Teamworks now mean that more clubs will be able to access the Zelus capabilities and expertise?
Yeah, I think it does. That has changed relatively recently. So when when we were Zelus, had this very exclusive model of, we're going to just work with a couple teams, and it's still in some sense self-constraining, because the thing of what we've done at Zelus, I got to stop calling it Zelus. I guess I should say Teamworks now, but is that we've really made sure that we are the best of the best. So we have the biggest football analytics group in the world, and we have because of this, I firmly believe we have the best data engineering infrastructure. We have the best models, the best player evaluations, the best player projections, the best translations across leagues, understanding how players move up and down as they sort of move up and down the pyramid, all these kinds of things, right? And that's been developed over decades, maybe well over 100 person years of work at this point has gone into this, what we do. So, roughly 10 people for 10 years is kind of the ballpark. Although that's not quite how it panned out, but that's, so because of this, because of the sort of where we're framing ourselves, is that it's expensive to build. And so because of that, because we're sort of at the very top of the ecosystem, there's a cost that prices out clubs. Like for the majority of clubs where you're just like, oh, I just want to have a little bit of analytics. I want to sort of dabble, and, I'm not going to sort of make it a key part of what I do. You shouldn't be spending all that much on analytics, right? Go get like an inexpensive data set and maybe just focus your, back to making the main thing. If you don't have a clear strategy on how you're going to use data and analytics to make better decisions, don't waste money on it. Spend your money where you know you can get value, right? If you know how to get value from an additional physiotherapist, get another physiotherapist. Don't spend a bunch of money on data and an analyst that you're going to stick in the corner and ignore. It's a total waste of time and money, right? But conversely for that, if you're a club that sort of is making data a core part of your decision-making process and really making it be a driver of the way you make decisions, then yeah, you want the best of the best. So I think it's inherently limited because the number of clubs that fall into that latter bucket is very small still. Most clubs that are doing data analytics, they have an analytics person, but they, stick them in a corner and treat them like a house plant. And they often have them just because the owner says, oh, we need to do Moneyball, quote unquote. Right? But they're not making use of them in any meaningful way. So for those clubs, again, it's like you shouldn't be wasting resources and time. But for the handful of clubs that are really using it as a driver of competitive advantage, then the sort of Zelus Teamworks model then starts to really make sense.
Can analytics potentially touch every part of the football department then? So we're thinking about, performance, medical, recruitment, coaching. It should touch everything.
Yeah, one of the challenges, one of the things that I think clubs do wrong is they think of their performance group and their analytics group is different. I think the best clubs sort of have these things fully integrated. If you want to be in a spot where you can very naturally go from, hey, here's how this player sort of fatigue is impacting their performance on the pitch, or is their athletic measures on the pitch, how it's impacting their decision making on the ball. And for that, you need sort of full integration of these two groups. So to answer the question more directly, I think it can have broad impact. But again, I think a lot of clubs go in and say we need analytics to be smarter without a clear directive on exactly the how it's going to make them smarter. And the way I like to think of it is ultimately, if you're not changing decisions or improving decisions, you're not doing anything, right? So the clubs should think about what are the set of decision points that we're going to improve and how are we going to improve them. So maybe we're going to be more efficient in the transfer market and have lower variability, like lower fail rate on our transfers in. We're going to be smarter about contract management and just viewing and like, this is kind of an aside, but I think a lot of clubs don't even have ways to visualize and see their contracts, right? Like the fact that you can't at one glance see how all of your players are doing, how much time's left on their contracts, the options, all these types of things in a really clear, simple visual way. That should be table stakes, but for some reason it's not. And anyway, I think in terms of analytics impact, I think there is a chance for broad impact. Teams should probably focus on where they know they can actually make that impact, or where they can actually create the opportunity for data to have that impact. The other thing I will say is that there's certain areas where the data just doesn't exist, where it's not good enough. In football, we have very limited financial data. A lot of the data even around biokinematics and so on is very limited or unclear at this moment. we don't get good data or any data at the lower tiers and young kids. So it can be really hard to sort of look at the projection of youth. So in those areas, maybe long-term you think, it's absolutely reasonable to think in the future we can create value in our academy and so on from data. But for the most part, at the moment, it's pretty limited.
And could you just tell us a bit more about Teamworks Intelligence, please? So if I'm a club and I'm thinking of using this, is it a separate product I buy? Does it touch other products? Is it mainly analysis, or is it raw data that could you just tell us the whole thing if that's okay?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way what Teamworks does, the Teamworks Intelligence, the sort of analytics part of Teamworks does across all the sports is sort of this realization that if you buy the data, so in football, it's like, if you're talking about StatsBomb or Opta or Skill Corner or others, you get a lot of times clubs get this data and then they realize like, the raw data is almost useless in and of itself. Okay, so then I got to hire a bunch of data scientists to like build a bunch of things on top of it. But the raw data in and of itself is very limited utility. This is like why tracking data for the longest time, they did things like they just looked at counting sprints and how far did a player go. These things are useless, but it's easy to calculate, right? It's like what comes out of the raw data. So that just shows you like that, for the longest time, the sort of analytical layer on top of this tracking data has just been like, let's just count how far a player went, which is the simplest thing you can do and not terribly insightful. But if all of a sudden now you sort of have this whole suite of sort of statistical machine learning models that sit on top of this, then you can actually start to turn all this raw data, this sort of tremendous amount of data that's being collected now, right? Whether it's event data, tracking data, kinematic data, financial data, etc., pulling that all together and creating like actionable intelligence and insights from it. Before you had maybe just simple raw data. Now you have player evaluations, you have breakdowns of player skill to say, instead of just the raw, this player passed from here to here, you can say, hey, this player is really good at this type of pass. They make the right decision when they pass. They execute on those passes really well. They're really efficient in X, Y, and Z, and they're sort of very inefficient at these other things. So I would say what we do is we're not a data collector. There's these great companies, StatsBomb, Opta, Skill Corner, and others that collect this data, or even the fixed tracking installs, Second Spectrum and the like. Our whole ethos is taking that raw data and taking the models, again, that we've built over with this huge team over the last really decade, to turning it into really actionable intelligence. If I were to boil it down, like the absolute simplest thing, and this is like drastically oversimplifying what we do, would be say, hey, we take this data and we tell you which players are good and which players are bad.
Yeah, superb. It's good to have a strap line like that.
Yeah.
Fantastic. And I just wanted to end the pod by looking to the future of analytics. Yeah. So I think it's moved on quite a bit, as we said from the last pod. What are going to be the big developments in the next, say, 2 or 3 years? Do you think? We hear a lot about AI, machine learning, and so on.
Yeah, the AI piece is interesting. Mostly when people think about AI these days, they're thinking about large language models, fundamentally around text. And I think there's actually been some interesting things there, like 12 has used it and so on, where they're essentially just taking standard analytical models and outputs and then using these tools to turn it into like interpretable human language. Right, which is really good because we spend a ton of time thinking about data visualization, but it's so much more natural for a human to just read this player is really good at this and has these attributes and blah blah blah, rather than sort of trying to extract that out from some data visualization or some sort of table of numbers. So on the AI piece, that's sort of where we are now. Although this idea of artificial intelligence sort of running a team, we are a long ways away from that. But the sort of machine learning piece, that is essentially what we do, and what a lot of these sort of analytics companies are doing is sort of building models, and ideally they're doing it in an interpretable and a decomposable way, so you can sort of understand why the model says what it says. But we're sort of well into that. People talk about the future. I think in a way the future's there. Where I think we hopefully see some evolution is on, again, I keep pounding this, but on the execution side. If you looked at the clubs that are using data heavily, Liverpools of the world, the Brentfords and the Brightons and so on, I bet if you asked them, would they be better off making great decisions with worse data, or having better data but like having a worse process? They would choose the better process and worse data all day long, right? And so we're at a point now, like at Teamworks, where we have these incredible models. And our partners who are executing well on them are having a tremendous amount of success. But you can also see that there are clubs out there spending a tremendous amount on data that are not, and it comes down to just having not having the processes in place to use these, or in some cases just completely ignoring, having big analytics departments and then just completely ignoring them. So if I were to say what's going to be the biggest evolution, I actually am not that fascinated about the sort of technical evolution, because I think we're in a spot now where, on a technical perspective, we're so far beyond what teams are actually executing on. So I think the thing I'd say, or at least I hope to see, is a big change in how teams execute on that data. And that's going to take a while, honestly, because a lot of the folks that are running football clubs right now don't have that expertise. They don't know how to use an analytics department, the output of an analytics department, to improve their decision making. So it's probably going to require a combination of, changing the personnel, upskilling people that are currently in their jobs, et cetera, to really understand this, to be able to think probabilistically. There's not an MLB or baseball front office in the world that doesn't think probabilistically about every decision, and that hasn't read Thinking Fast and Slow to deeply understand cognitive biases and sort of behavioral economics. I could probably count on one hand the amount of football clubs in the world that truly think probabilistically and could tell you what hindsight bias is or outcome bias is. Right, so we're a long ways away from front offices having those skills, and so that's kind of, if I were to say the one thing, it'd be like having the horsepower in the front office to actually execute on these things.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. I think it's quite easy to get seduced by the technology, isn't it, as you say, because Our last podcast was about tracking data, and we spoke to Genius Sports, who've acquired Second Spectrum. They've got this new thing called mesh tracking, and they can get billions of data points per match.
Right.
But like you say, if you're not actually executing on kind of the more basic forms of data, then does that help you that much?
Yeah, look, I think there's going to be a lot of teams out there and leagues that spend a lot of money on this data and then get no value from it. But that said, there'll probably be one or two who put in the effort and have the systems replaced and will actually get a tremendous amount. So again, I think the sort of technical evolution is multiple steps ahead of where the clubs are, but it is changing. What I tend to see is it doesn't happen as a change where everyone's just getting a little bit smarter all the time. What tends to happen is a given club maybe has a new owner or whatever and sort of starts from scratch and goes heavy into it. So it's the way the sort of evolution is happening. It's not like this, everyone's getting a little smarter every year. It tends to be like an entire club flips to being sort of smarter and more data driven. Like a good example, this is Como, where the previous ownership had no data analytics at all. New ownership comes in, they invest heavily in analytics, and all of a sudden they're making tons of smart decisions. So it's happening as individual clubs taking that step, and in the aggregate it looks like, we're slowly getting more analytical, but in reality it's individual clubs taking that step, and then next year maybe another club sort of has that evolution, and that's sort of how it tends to look.
Yeah, and it does seem that a big step now is to focus on that decision making, as you say. So we had a guy called Mo Bobat spoke at our conference, and it was about decision making. Some clubs have this role as well. It's could kind of go between the data scientist and then the manager or sporting director. So that does seem to be a big area for development.
Yeah, those people can add a lot of value, and especially if they're empowered. If it's such where the sporting director feels strongly that person is going to be a key part of our decision making and drive decision making, or maybe you have an owner that says, look, this is critical and we're not going to make any decision without this, then that can be a good way to go for sure.
Yeah. And just a final question, what next for you, Luke? How long do you stay with Teamworks and what then?
Yeah, again, I really like what Teamworks is doing. I like the product, I like the people, I like the vision. So, planning to continue on working with them, helping them sort of execute on that vision in the years to come. And then we're out now, now that we've been out of Toulouse for about the last 4 or 5 months. We've been out of Milan for over a year now. Looking at, going back and doing this again. I think we had a lot of success at Toulouse and it was a lot of fun. And wanting to essentially take this to the next level, replicate it, and ultimately, take it one step further.
Well, that's fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast again.
Thanks, Simon.
Thank you for listening to the Training Ground Guru podcast in association with Teamworks Intelligence. We'll be back next month with another episode.